on this drizzly morning. We've got the sun shining inside, so I hope you'll have a good time. I'm Joanne Bundy, and I show up to remind you to please silence your cell phones and turn on your tea coil. This morning is the second class of Jean Ketter's course on disability and being human. I'm happy again to introduce to you Professor of Education at Grinnell College, Jean Ketter.
Thank you. Can people hear me? No. She can. How's that? No? Keep talking. Keep talking. Is that better? More breath support, right? Okay. All right. I will try to speak from my diaphragm. Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming back. I was imagining that there were 3 people here today. You know, I have taught for 40 years, and every night before the first day of class, I'm here. I think, it's going to be terrible. And when you teach high school, and you're my size, you realize they could all rise up and revolt. It's never happened completely. When I first started teaching in high school, some revolts happened, but yeah, so I appreciate your coming back and trying again. I received some friendly critique last week, both from my friends and from myself when I watched the YouTube video. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I saw that I spoke very rapidly and that I used lots of ums. So I'm going to try to fix that today. This is not really my milieu. As I said, I usually teach classes of 12 to 15 where my lovely students have no trouble interrupting me. So I love them for that. So I'll do my best. If I do start to speak too quickly, maybe Joanne, you can, make some sort of signal, but I realized last week that was very rapid speaking. Yeah. Very rapid speaking. Today, I want to transition from last week by giving you some information I learned from Kent McClelland, who's a sociology professor at Grinnell College, and Catherine was in the audience last. I don't know if she's here today. Hi, Catherine. Catherine was in the audience last week, and she told me that Kent had taught a class on eugenics. Well, actually, he didn't teach a class on eugenics. What am I saying? He taught a class on reproduction and reproductive rights. He co-taught that class, and in that class he taught about eugenics at Grinnell. I had no idea that, as I said last week, eugenics was a subject in very elite institutions, apparently, including Grinnell. How's my sound? Good? Please signal back there if you can't hear me, okay? So there were 3 professors at Grinnell who either were involved in popularizing eugenics or were actually teaching it. The first was Fanny Cook Gates. She was a physicist. She had been at Goucher College, and she came to Grinnell in 1913. She apparently didn't make it as a physics professor at Grinnell. I'm not sure what that was all about. But she quickly transitioned to being Dean of Women and taught a class in the mental and physical hygiene department, which was a new department created maybe just for her. And she did have a course that included topics such as heredity and eugenics. She was an avowed eugenicist. Henry Conard he's who the Sierra is named after. He was a botanist, and he was at Grinnell from 1906 to 1944. He co-authored a book, Heredity, Fragility of Bone, and he co-authored this with Charles B. Davenport, who was a very well-known and respected eugenicist in the country. So the third is Edward Steiner, and he is the person for whom the building I work in was named. I think his history isn't quite as dark, perhaps, as Fanny Cook Gates. He was very interested in immigration. He wrote several books on immigration. I could not find anything about this book. I'm sure it exists, but maybe it's just not in print or anything like that. The Making of a Great Race. But he wrote several books on immigration. I really got kind of lost in this whole thing. He was a Jew who converted to Christianity after he came to the United States. And he had had a terrible experience after immigrating, in the process of immigrating and being an immigrant in the United States. He wrote an autobiography, if you're interested. It's just horrifying. Everything bad that could have happened, I think. But he did have faith in the idea that someone could come to this country and become a good American. He just didn't think that they would be the best American. He still had this sense that there were some people who were lesser than others. Sometimes we might call this positive eugenics. This is the Galton idea that you marry well, you make sure that that your stock is of high quality. He advocated for that, but he was not, I think, as much of a eugenicist maybe as the other two people. The other thing I want to talk about today, I should have talked about this last week. George is haunting me here as a historian. We have to be humble because last week when I showed you some of the practices, read you some of the quotes, it is horrifying. And it does feel outrageous to think that people believed some of the things that people used to believe. My students, when I teach this course, are just, their mouths are agape, and they're going, how could we have possibly done this? How could we think, all sorts of things like women were inferior, and if they, apparently, if they did the ski jump at the Olympics, their uteruses would fall off, or something like that. It's just ridiculous. That's not that long ago. And they're always just sort of, what are you talking about? And I have to remind them and myself that 50 to 100 years from now, people are going to look back on the way we currently are treating people perceived to have disabilities, and they're going to be aghast, right? So I like this idea of the fish is swimming along in the ocean. It doesn't see the water. The water is just there. And the ocean that we're swimming in is filled with assumptions and biases and prejudices that are invisible to us. And so we must be humble in our outrage. Just want to make that clear. Okay. The other thing, I was so inarticulate about this last week, so I wanted to try to fix that. This is a summary of the statement from the American Anthropological Association, their statement on race. It was made in 1988, which is, when you think about it, kind of late. There was still disagreement among anthropologists about the nature of race, whether there was more than one race. So the executive board of the AAA decided that they needed to make a public statement about this topic. And you'll notice that they say it's just a majority of anthropologists who are thinking this. So there's still some anthropologists out there in 1988 who don't quite buy into the idea that there's only one human race. I said this last week, but as I said, I wasn't very articulate. 94% of genetic variation exists between or within a so-called racial group. So looking out here, I'm going to assume we would all be raised as white. There's more variation between George and my husband David than there would be between this group and a group of people who have dark skin. So the idea that we can know anything about anybody by the color of their skin, such as their intelligence or their tendency toward viciousness or something like that, what we talked about last week, is wrong. These physical variations have absolutely no meaning except what we put on them. So we see someone with dark skin and we immediately think we know something about them. We don't know anything about them, except that they have dark skin. But because of racism and because this is a racist country, we assume we know something, especially if it's a male, especially if it's a young male. We know that person's dangerous, or we know maybe we think they're maybe not as intelligent, those kinds of things. None of us here think that, of course, but. Then finally, I think this is really important. The racial worldview was invented. It was invented to assign some groups to perpetual low status, while others were permitted access to privilege, power, and wealth. It's an invention that allows the people doing the inventing and doing the racing to have privilege and power. It made it possible for us to say, of course we can go west and take those people's lands, because they weren't really fully human. So when I'm talking about race, please keep in mind this statement. I'm not talking about something that exists biologically. I'm just talking about a very powerful concept that still shapes our experiences in this country. And a final note, before we move on to talk about theories of disability, I have a wonderful yoga teacher named Monica Santangelo. Maybe some of you know her. She's fabulous. Yay, Monica. And I was talking about this, how badly I did last week with my speaking too fast and all my ums. And I said something about Buck versus Bell, and she said, I heard about that on the radio. So this is really interesting. I didn't know I was so cool. So apparently, a man named Adam Cohen just wrote a book. Oh, it should be, is it? I guess it is. Imbeciles, and it's about the Buck versus Bell trial. So I think the library should get it, don't you? If you're interested, you can obviously ask them to get it for you. He, in his interview that I listened to, he said that there were 70,000 people forcibly sterilized. Last week I told you it was only 30,000. It's kind of horrifying. I love this quote. He says, feeble-minded, remember that Carrie and Vivian and what's my first name? Were all considered feeble-minded and promiscuous. Feeble-minded was really the craze in American eugenics. There was this idea that we were being drowned in a tide of feeble-mindedness, that basically unintelligent people were taking over, reproducing more quickly than the intelligent people. But it was also a very malleable term that was used to define large categories of people that, again, were disliked by someone who was in a decision-making position. So you see how that's like race? And this 1924 immigration law, I talked about it a little bit last time, but he spoke more about it in his interview. And I learned, maybe some of you knew this, the immigration law eliminated anybody from Eastern Europe, Poles, anybody from Eastern Europe, it was particularly Jews, Southern Europeans, Italians. They were considered undesirable, and so they were very carefully screened for their quality. And Otto Frank applied for visas for his family and was refused because he was a Jew, and I hadn't known that. I knew that we refused lots of Jews, I just didn't know it was Otto Frank's, that Otto Frank had applied for a visa. The same applied for people with disabilities. This ad was in an article I looked at in Disability Studies Quarterly, which is a great journal. Girl immigrants, though not required to be strikingly beautiful, they must be above 4'8". Whew, I made it, just barely. And in no way deformed or disfigured, even by a squint. So this is, remember we talked about glasses last week? If you had any kind of vision problem, you were out. All right, so now we're going to move on to the actual topics for today. There are three, this is me. If you go into another source, they might tell you there are more or fewer, but this is my thinking about how we see disability. There's a medical model, which I believe arises out of probably eugenics, but certainly this 20th century emphasis on genetic and biological difference. There's a social and cultural model, which is developed in part by advocates of disability rights movement. And then there's a critical disability theory model, which I made up. Okay. It's linked to critical race studies and deconstructionist theory, and I'll talk more about that later. The term critical in my field always means political and looking for social justice. It means something different in other fields, but critical for me means we're trying to make things equitable, and we're looking for ways, assumptions, behaviors that keep that from happening. The first model, medical model, is the most prominent, and it's still in play, very much so in the United States when we talk about disability. The idea with the medical model is that we need to discover or diagnose the disability. And this disability is solely within the person. So when we say somebody is disabled in the medical model, we're saying there's something wrong with them. There's something in them that isn't quite right. And it's permanent and it's biological. Mostly biological. This disability is a defect that is resulting from an abnormality or an injury. Sometimes the abnormality is a chromosomal disorder, like Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, dwarfism, Fragile X. Sometimes it's brain damage during birth or after from some sort of accident. But there are also unknown disabilities. We really don't always know the cause of some of these. Epilepsy, we don't always know the cause of epilepsy. We don't know the cause of autism. We don't know the cause of ADHD. We know that they are disabilities somehow, and I'll talk more about that later. But the idea is that this model places, this is the important idea, that this model places the disability within the person. See, I'm taking my time. Another tenet of the medical model is that the disability is permanent. So we do say sometimes people are temporarily disabled if they have to have surgery and they can't walk or something like that. But when we're thinking about a biological or a genetic cause, it can't be eradicated. Not yet anyway, although it is interesting. I think people are moving forward with the idea of altering genetic makeup within a living person. And obviously there's been lots of dissension about this idea of designer babies. A person with cerebral palsy always has cerebral palsy. The person who is brain damaged always has brain damage. Now, sometimes with a stroke or some things like that, there can be the appearance of normality, but oftentimes there are going to be lingering problems because of that damage. Even though this is permanent, the medical field is working very, very, very hard to ameliorate it or lessen it. So the goal of the medical model is, you have this fixed problem within you, and I want to try to fix it, right? I want to ameliorate it, make it less. And the treatments in many cases are pretty invasive. There's always some sort of intervention. There's behavioral therapy, if you've heard about behavioral therapy. Sometimes this is used with autistic children. There's electroconvulsive therapy, there's drugs, there's dietary changes, those kinds of things that are proposed for ameliorating a disability. And in the case of intellectual and behavioral disabilities, the whole idea is to make the person behave more like a normal person. So to sort of either maybe change the behavior or hide the behavior that seems abnormal. Children with autism and other conditions with behavioral therapies are often use reinforcers like M&Ms to get the child to do eye contact. Because eye contact is a normal human behavior, and to not look at people is not normal. So you teach the child to use eye contact. You might also, there's something called stemming with autistic kids. People on the spectrum, there's like repeated behavior. Sometimes it's flapping the arms, sometimes it's moving the hands. And the parents are encouraged to, the way that you make that behavior go away is you don't provide any reinforcement. You either ignore the child or you try to distract the child to do something else. In the case of mental illnesses, such as bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, it's often that people are prescribed drugs. And with ADHD, the same is true. Sometimes there's also psychotherapy, but drugs are used. And in children, this is controversial because drugs in young children can have effects that we haven't really understood. And I think that we'll talk more about ADHD, but I think the idea of using stimulants with very young children has been written about and challenged. The other thing about disability is that when you say someone is abnormal, you draw this line in the sand. You're saying, here is normal, here is abnormal. There is no way to be partly normal or partly abnormal. It's a binary. You are either are or you aren't. A person that this binary that's created bases its distinction on something that's really a made-up thing too, the idea of the normal. There is no normal, but we pretend like there's a normal and we measure people and behaviors against that in order to label them as abnormal. A normal human being would look a certain way, move a certain way, interact a certain way, have certain abilities, but really we don't know what that is. It isn't a thing. It is something that it moves all over the map too. What's normal here is not normal over here. So thinking about this binary is really important because it does cause problems. Here's an interesting, I guess I'll just read it to you. Apparently I didn't put a link in. I'm sorry. This is a description of someone with the abnormality called Fragile X. I don't know if anybody knows anyone or has a relative that may have this particular disorder. This is what you can know about a person if they have Fragile X. Physical features may include large ears, long face, soft skin. Connective tissues may include ear infections, flat feet, a high arched palate, double jointed fingers, and hyperflexible joints. And my point is that those things, what does that mean? What are large ears? What is a long face? Is your skin too soft? Maybe my skin is too soft. I don't know. So again, we're imagining that we know what we talk about when we say these things, but we don't. What does that even mean? And I'm not saying that Fragile X isn't a condition. I'm just saying that the way we decide it's a condition is problematic. Then we have this problem of these disabilities that the medical field knows exist. They're absolutely sure that they exist, but they can't find any biological cause. So we have ADHD. In 2015, there had been a 43% rise in this was when the statistic was published. Between 2003 and 2011, there was a 43% rise in the diagnosis of ADHD. And this doesn't make sense, right? Unless we think that there's some sort of maybe environmental cause, or why would there be such a huge increase in the diagnosis? The thing that I happen to believe about ADHD that I think you might find interesting too is because we don't have any genetic or biological way of diagnosing it, we use proxies. And these proxies are often surveys or questions that you ask. This is an example of some questions you would ask to decide whether someone had ADHD. Maybe. Am I not connected? I have to be connected to the internet. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. It's coming. All right. I think it's interesting. Look at the top. What's being diagnosed? Yes, drugs. Okay. Symptoms of inattention, often make careless mistakes, often has difficulty paying attention to tasks, often seems to not listen, often fails to follow through on instructions, schoolwork, or chores, often has difficulty, often avoids, often loses, often easily, often forgetful. Often interrupts, often has difficulty waiting his or her turn. This is a 6-year-old child that you might be talking about. Often leaves seat when remains seated is expected. Often runs or climbs where it is inappropriate. Who decides what's inappropriate? So my point being that they're very, very open to interpretation. And what happens is that the child, sometimes it's often a child, is causing problems in school, seems to have trouble paying attention, those kinds of things. And the teacher is asked to fill out this survey about the child. Sometimes the parent is as well. Then the child is referred to a medical specialist who says, yes, the child is ADHD, or no, the child is not, and then drugs are provided. I was going to show, I think at the bottom of this, it says, only an expert can do this. Right. Yeah. Yeah, right. What does it say? Yes, based on, oops, no, that's not it. think it's at the very bottom of the slide. Well, whatever. The idea is that only a doctor or other trained health professional can diagnose ADHD based on these questions. And often, at least from what I hear, the doctor doesn't observe the child, just goes on the basis of the responses from the teachers and the parents. And then there's autism spectrum disorder. Again, there's absolutely no medical tests. Some people think it's inherited. It does seem maybe to run in families, but they've not been able to find any genetic cause for it or any change in the brain that would indicate that autism is present. And look at these statistics. In 1980s, 1 in 2,000 children was diagnosed with autism. In 2000, it was 1 in 150. In 2012, it was 1 in 68. And in 2015, it was 1 in 45. Really? I mean, you kind of wonder, right? What does this mean? Again, let's look at the test, the proxy test. The questionnaire. How did I do that? Oh, up here. I gotta go back to it. Okay. Let's see if I can do this up. Hair trigger here. This is a little harder to see. I'm sorry. I'm just going to read some of them to you. This is the questionnaire that a parent or perhaps a teacher would look at to determine whether or not a child should be tested or should be examined. And I think it's really interesting. The one that confuses me is, okay, there's abnormal joy expression when seeing parents. What the heck is that? And then, but okay, that's a problem, abnormal joy, but it's really bad if the child doesn't reach to be picked up. So, again, I'm not saying that autism or the spectrum doesn't exist. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that these tests are so much based on interpretation. And if we already think that the child is on the spectrum and we give this exam, likely the child will be on the spectrum, diagnosed as being on the spectrum. How am I doing for speed? Is it better? I know I've still done some uhs, but I'm trying. Okay. The other thing that really bothers me about the medical model is that disability equals your identity. So once a person has this condition, that becomes the sole identity of the person. So, and I have actually heard this. He's a wheelchair. I've actually heard people say, he's a wheelchair. Or he's level 3. And that completely erases any humanity for that person. That person is nothing other than a disability. He's a blind man, rather than he's a person who really sings beautifully and he's blind. Or he's a mentally retarded boy. That's the only thing you need to know about him, and you know everything about him. But you don't. You don't know about his personality. You don't know about his talents. You don't know anything about him, really. Any more than you would know if I said he's black. And again, the person is often seen as weak or needing help or defective in all realms of existence. It sort of spreads so that, and you may have had this experience. I've had it before when I had surgery on my foot and I was wearing a cast on my foot, on my leg. It was like people thought they had to talk really loudly or they had to help me somehow. I mean, it was kindness, I think, but it's also this assumption, this sort of spread that, well, if this person has one disability, that means that they really can't do anything. And I have to tell the story on myself because this is I think it's a funny story, really. In high school, I attended a summer music camp at Kansas State University. I'd never been there before. I was very excited, but I was nervous. I grew up in a little town of 4,000, and I really wasn't used to getting around a big campus. I was worried I would get lost. None of my friends was going to music camp that year. I'm not sure why. Maybe I didn't have any friends. So I get there, and it turns out that my roommate is blind. And I think, oh no, I get lost all the time, and I'm going to have to lead this person all around campus. We're going to be wandering around like, like the Jews in the wilderness. We'll never be able to find anything. And I was a little worried too because I'd never really had any kind of relationship with somebody that was blind. So the first morning, I had a map. Of course, they give you a map, and I followed it diligently to our first rehearsal space. Fine, we rehearsed. Then we went to lunch, which wasn't too far away. And after lunch, we were expected to go back to our dorm, maybe have a little rest and relaxation, and then come to our next rehearsal place, which was not the same rehearsal place that we had gone to before. And I leave with my roommate, and we're walking, and I realize I am lost. I have no idea which way to turn. I don't know where the dorm is. And my husband will attest to this. I just kind of am directionally challenged. And so I said, I'm so sorry. We're going to have to find somebody to tell us where the dorm is because I'm lost. She says, oh, I know where it is. She had totally mapped it out in her head. She had no problems getting us back to the dorm. And so even something like that, where you would say maybe a blind person would have trouble getting around in three-dimensional space when you can't see, she was a lot better at it than I was. And the most disturbing thing is that children come to see themselves as abnormal. And we think, oh, they don't know that we said that they were abnormal. You know, they don't understand that, but they do. Because it's not as much the language as it is our behavior toward them. And then they internalize it, and they become a person who is disabled because they believe that they're disabled themselves. I have a story to tell that's, I think, illustrative. I had a really good friend. She was a social worker and decided to go back and be an elementary teacher. And she was teaching first grade. This was a long time ago, but I'm afraid maybe things haven't changed that much. She had already received from the kindergarten teacher the 3 groups for reading that she should have in her class, according to the kindergarten teacher. These are the kids who are reading, these are the kids who are ready to read, and these are the kids who need more instruction. So being the dutiful person that she was, she put her kids in those 3 groups. And she said, you all can name yourselves. Name your group. What do you want your group to be called? And so the kids that were already reading called themselves the Bluebirds. We're the Bluebirds. And the kids that were ready to read and right on time, they were in first grade, they should be ready to read, they named themselves the Robins or something. And then she said, well, the group that wasn't ready, that was behind, what do you want to name yourselves? I said, we name ourselves the Monkeys. And she said, the Monkeys? Why the Monkeys? Because we're silly, because we're dumb. Really, they knew it. They already knew it. They're first graders, and they know. So we don't hide anything from children, and they internalize it and know what. You'll see in the film that I showed the last day, the little boy who has Down syndrome at one point is sitting there and he goes, I'm so dumb. No one's told him he's dumb, but he knows it. The other thing about the medical model that bothers me is that it relieves responsibility. So we don't have to think about our own behavior. It's inside the person. It's their problem, really. Now, we could be nice and we can accommodate and those kinds of things, but really it's inside the person. So what could we do? This book, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, was written in 1996. That wasn't that long ago, 20 years ago. Its basic premise is that the poor in our country, the unfortunate, the people that haven't done well, are just less intelligent. Now, you can read race all over this, because if you look at percentage of people who live in the inner city who are poor, although there are more poor white people in the United States than there are people of color, that's only because there are more white people. But percentage-wise, there are more people of color who are poor. So this is also race, although the authors sort of stay away from that. But they talk about ethnic groups. So they don't say race, they say ethnic group, but they mean race. So basically what they're saying is that because intelligence is inherited and different ethnic groups have different amounts of intelligence, it's really not worth it to try to raise up those people who are genetically inferior. We're spending all this money and all this effort, and honestly, it's just not worth it. We should be spending our time and energy on those people who have potential. This is what this book says. And I think it's interesting that a lot of people poo-pooed it, said it was wrong, it's based on an invalid concept of race, as we know. But not everybody. This is a quote from one reviewer. Herrnstein and Murray were merely bringing up facts that were well known in the scientific community, but perhaps best not discussed in public. A Papua New Guinean language has a term for it, Mokita, and it means truth that we all know but agree not to talk about. I could talk more about this. I don't want to get into too much detail, but they use statistics, which you know that saying about there's statistics and they're easy to fool people. what they do is they look at the statistics of IQ based on ethnic groups. So they look at African American IQ scores, they look at white IQ scores, they look at Asian IQ scores. I'm not sure what other IQ scores they use. Honestly, I have not read the whole book, I just read pieces of it. But the idea is, well, see, right here, these IQ scores are lower. Therefore, it's really not that different from the lead shot idea, right? So these are people living in poor communities who have poor resources, they have poor health care. Everything about being in poverty that can affect somebody's ability to focus on a test, plus we already looked at one IQ test, you know that they are definitely culturally biased. So this idea that we know because this person is dark-skinned that he has less intelligence than the person who's white-skinned is in this book in 1996. And it was popular. It scares me. And the other thing about this responsibility, this idea of relieving responsibility is, well, let's just medicate. Since it's in the person, and we want to fix the person, let's just give them medicine. Let's not try any mediation, let's not try any accommodation, let's just give them medicine and then they'll be fine. And it's not really that simple, but that's sort of the premise behind this idea that because it's in the person, it can be fixed by fixing the person, not by fixing the person's environment. And the other thing that is interesting about this is there's a really interesting article that we read in my class about why parents want their children to be labeled with a disability. Why would you want that? Parents advocate all the time for their children to be labeled as ADHD or LD or something like that. It's because it relieves the parent of diagnosis, of responsibility. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I completely understand it because we tend to blame parents when children misbehave, right? Oh, they have a bad family or they don't have good parents, something like that. So when a parent can say to the school, it's in the kid, it's nothing I did wrong. That child is messed up inside and I'm a wonderful parent and it's not my fault. And I understand that. I would have the same impulse, I think. The child can also use that diagnosis. You know, I can't do this. And I've heard children say this, I need my medication. I've heard children say that. I didn't take my medication today, I can't do this worksheet. And this is good because it's not that the child is lazy, it's not that the child refuses to pay attention. The child can't help himself. And so he's off the hook in a way. And I don't know that that's a bad thing, it's just an interesting sort of, I guess, response or an implication for this idea that the disability is inside the child. This is also interesting. I found this when I was preparing for this group. Schools, this article by Hinshaw and Scheffler in 2014, you saw the rise in the ADHD and autism spectrum. The same thing that's happened with LD, which is learning disabled, which is a really amorphous category that probably means nothing. But there has been a lot of pressure on schools to get kids labeled. And I don't know if you know this about the No Child Left Behind law, but it's an interesting thing. If the No Child Left Behind law wants you to compare the statistics, the performance of all the kids in your school, the whole population, with other populations in the country and in the state. And you want your people to be high performing. Well, the state allows you, or the law allows you to leave out people who have particular disabilities in that big population. You can separate them out and test them separately so that their low scores don't pull down the whole score of the school. And so you can see how schools would be motivated to get those kids out of the testing group that's going to determine whether or not they have to be closed, for example. So it does make sense. It's also, you have to have a certain percent of the people in your school be in that category. So if you have a very small school, and I've looked at statistics, it happens. If you have a very small school and you only have, let's say, 400 kids in your high school, you have to have, I think it's 40, maybe 40, 10% or 15% of the kids have to be left out. You have to say, oh, a certain percent of the kids have to be in special ed in order for them to be not within the big group because of statistics. And so schools will literally move kids over into special ed, test them, and then move them back so that their scores are not. So this is not, it's a result of the law. It's not, I don't think it's malfeasance by the schools really. It's just a way of escaping the very punitive results of getting low scores on those tests. The other thing about labeling and saying somebody is disabled, that it makes it really easy to communicate. Like I said, oh, that person's a wheelchair, or that person is mentally retarded, or that person is LD, or that person is ADHD. We think we know a whole lot about that person because we've given him that label or her that label. So it makes it easy to communicate with parents, especially parents who maybe not be as well educated as some other parents or just not as savvy. But it also makes it easy to communicate with the public. So I think it's an ease of communication because it reifies, because it reduces people to just a label. So I'm going to stop there for a break. How'd I do? Did I do better?
All right, if you're ready, Jean Tedder will continue with the class. Jean Tedder.
So another implication or a problem, in my opinion, that this medical model creates is this idea of specialization. When you assign a disability to a person, especially I'm thinking of children here, and it takes a kind of special intervention, then the parent is not an expert in it. The parent has to be an expert in order to deal with the child. And many times that can alienate the parent or make the parent feel inadequate. So I think about the idea of when a child is on the spectrum of autism, the kinds of advice parents get for dealing with their children is really time consuming. And it needs to be. I'm not an expert. But it does, I've talked with parents who say, well, I'm just not up to this task. I'm not a good enough parent to be able to deal with this particular child because I don't have the expertise, or I don't have the patience, or I don't have the ability to do this. And so also there are a lot of sorts of complications with these drug treatments. The film that you're going to see on the last day of class, the little boy in the story, Peter, when he's in 3rd grade, he's not taking any drugs at all. But by the time he's in high school, he's taking an antidepressant, he's taking Adderall for ADHD, and he's taking anxiety, some sort of Paxil or something. He's taking 3 different kinds of pills in order to get through the day, and the parents have to keep track of these pills, when he's taken them, when he hasn't, how many he's had, that kind of thing. So it ends up being a very, very time-consuming kind of task, and it can be really daunting to people who maybe aren't as savvy as some parents. And I've heard when I'm supervising student teachers or when I'm in classrooms, teachers complaining because the parents aren't taking care of the child. They didn't make him take his medicine today. They forgot to send his medicine with him. So this is a very medicalized sort of situation. I was supervising student teachers in Kansas City quite a while ago, but it was a very, very affluent suburb. The school was beautiful. I was looking at a middle school class or a junior high class, and I talked to the teacher, and she had a project where they were supposed to write about their favorite place to go for vacation, which is problematic when you think about it, but anyway. Lots of kids were kids of divorce. They like to go to their mom's house. They like to go to their dad's cabin. I was reading these papers and going, wow, it doesn't look like many of these kids are from families that are not divorced. She said, no, most of them are from divorced families. She said 2/3 of them take antidepressants. 2/3 of these kids, affluent white kids. And I'm thinking, okay, divorce is hard on children. I just have to be a little skeptical that 2/3 of them really needed antidepressants. And now that we know how dangerous antidepressants are for young people, it's even scarier. Also, teachers need special training. So this is something that bothers me, and the teachers among you can argue with me and disagree. Please feel free to do that in your head, not out loud, because it wouldn't work. You can do that afterwards. But the problem with this is that the idea says to you, as a regular classroom teacher, you cannot handle these children. These children are disabled. There's something wrong with them. They're not normal. And so you're teaching them normal children, and so you really don't have the expertise to deal with these children. So we need a special ed teacher who's got a master's degree to help you figure out how to deal with these children. That I'm not saying that a regular classroom teacher couldn't benefit from more preparation and more education about dealing with diversity in the classroom. But my students are always shocked when they get into a classroom and they realize, oh my gosh, I don't have any kids in special ed in this classroom, and there are kids in my class who can't read. There are kids in my class who can't stay in their seat. When I taught high school, I had a kid in my class who literally had to get up and walk around the room about every 5 minutes. He just had to. He wasn't in special ed. So this idea that, A, the teacher thinks that my young, naive teachers think they're going to get in a classroom and everybody's going to be the same, they're all going to be normal, whatever that means. And if there are special ed kids in the classroom, there'll be somebody there to help them. Well, the other problem with this specialization is that there's a huge shortage of special education teachers, probably for a lot of the reasons we thought about. There's almost a stigma associated with being a special ed teacher, because you're dealing with those not normal kids. Unless you're gifted ed, I'm not even going to get into that, but that's different. Because if you're gifted ed, that's good. But anyway, so you're a special ed teacher, and the special ed teacher, we don't have enough of them. There's a huge shortage. And so what happens is by law, that child is supposed to have somebody in the class with him to help him. And so sometimes we hire people with high school diplomas who have very little training to be an aid to that child. And honestly, maybe I'm being unfair, but many times these aides are worse than not having an aide. They yell at the kid, they pull papers out of the kid's hands, they literally block them from the rest of the class so that they're not included. So no fault of the person, they don't have training. So my answer to that problem is smaller classes. That's my answer. People who say class size doesn't matter are wrong. It matters. Right, Lynn? Yes. Yes. So if I have 14 children in my classroom, and one of them is supposedly special ed, I'm going to be able to deal with that child a lot better than if I have 24, even if I don't have an aide. And sometimes aides are wonderful. I've seen terrific aides. I'm not saying that they're all bad, but I've seen some really bad ones. And this is a problem. If we really think that you need special training to be working with special ed kids, why are we putting somebody who has a high school diploma working with this child? I've seen people who don't know how to do the activity working with a child. It's in math, and they can't do the math. And they're supposed to be helping the child do the math. I mean, it's a problem. And I think every principal would tell you this, every superintendent, we need special ed teachers. I think we need smaller classes and more preparation for regular classroom teachers. That would solve some of the problems. That's what I think. Okay. All right, now we're moving on to the social cultural model. Now this model is a sort of combo of the model I'm going to talk about last and the medical model. The social cultural model says, yes, there is some biological difference in this child that is causing an abnormality, but we also do it in our social context. It's a co-constructed idea. So a person could have a biological or medical problem, and it's our reaction to that person that matters. So our reaction to that person also matters. So because human behavior is interactive, we see the child is in a wheelchair. We see the child, we know the child has been placed in special ed. We know the child is taking medication. Well, that can shape our interaction, our response to the child. And our response to the child affects the child's response to us. It is an interactive thing. So we have to understand that context matters, and behavior is not just the behavior of the child. It's the behavior of everybody in that milieu with the child. So we make assumptions, and these assumptions sometimes are called the teacher expectancy assumptions. And I'm going to talk about this. I don't have a lot of it on the slide. I apologize for that. But this is teacher expectancy, or the Pygmalion effect, is, you know, the Pygmalion myth. The idea that if you think someone is going to do really well, they do really well. The psychologists who first discovered the Pygmalion effect were Jacobson and Rosenthal, and they were experimenting or making a study in a school in California, and you may have heard about this study. I also want to tell you that I'm going to talk about the problems with the study, but just for the sake of explanation. They told the teachers that they'd given these kids IQ tests, their children in their classroom IQ tests, and they said, a third of these kids are going to blossom. They're just ready, they're so smart, they're going to do so well, they're just going to, just really, really blossom. And then we have your regular kids, about a third of the kids are just sort of plugging along, doing okay. And then we have this third of the kids that are really going to struggle. What they didn't tell the teachers is that this was totally random. They were not looking at IQ scores at all. They gave the teacher evidence. They said, these are these kids' IQs, these are their IQs, these are their... But they were made up. And guess what? The kids did exactly as they were predicted to do. This is what I mean when I say it's a co-constructed idea. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about this study because nobody's been able to replicate it. And so that's kind of an issue. But there have been other studies. One of the problems with replicating that study, or with any study, is that you have different people, different teachers, different schools, different children. It's all very difficult in psychology to replicate anything, unless you reduce it to something very, very simple. But we do know from other studies where the teacher isn't assigned, where you don't, that was kind of maybe unethical too, to say this group is going to struggle. You think about that, that's a little unethical. But they have done it in different ways, and they have discovered that teachers do, when they expect something from a child, they tend to get it from the child. And I think maybe they expect something from the child because they recognize the child is really bright and quick and curious and interested. But there also are other factors, like the child's race. Maybe the child has a visible handicap. Those kinds of things can also affect our expectancy in ways that they probably shouldn't. We really don't know how it works. We still can't figure it out, but it does seem to happen. There's also something called the Gollum effect, which, if you know about the Gollum, you know that this is not good. We wish every teacher had the Pygmalion effect for every child in his or her class, and some wonderful teachers do, but there are teachers who have the Gollum in their classroom. Now, I'm going to talk about this book. I actually had the library buy it, so if you're interested in reading it, I think it's a fascinating book. It's called Ability Profiling in School Failure. One Boy's Struggle to be Seen as Competent. It might make you cry. It's very sad. But anyway, here's the premise. Kathy Collins, the author, is a university researcher, and she goes into a classroom as a consultant for a new science program that they're trying to implement. The university is sort of a hands-on, more doing science rather than learning, memorizing science kind of program. And so she's in the classroom to help the teacher implement this new science program. She enters a classroom at the beginning of the school year and notices one little boy, Jay. Jay is one of 2 African Americans in the classroom. The rest of the kids are white. And she knows from the teacher that Jay has just moved from another community, what the teacher calls a dangerous community, to live with his grandparents, because we don't really know why he moved. He moved to this more affluent, whiter neighborhood to live with his grandparents and go to school there. His teacher, whose name is Laura, has already decided that Jay is different. He's very active, he's very excited, he raises his hand a lot, goes like that, wants to participate, but Laura doesn't see this enthusiasm as positive. She says he speaks before he's asked to speak, that when he gets excited, he doesn't make any sense. And Jay also speaks in a black dialect. It's not very long before Laura decides there's something wrong. There's something wrong. First she thinks maybe he's ED, at that time that's emotionally disabled or emotionally disturbed. Then she finds maybe it's LD. She's not sure, but she wonders, and she's considering maybe having him referred. But according to Kathleen Collins, Jay is just completely fine. There's nothing wrong. In fact, in one of the experiments they're doing with this Cartesian diver, I'm not going to go into it, but it's a science experiment, Jay figures out before anybody else how to make the diver and asks this wonderful question, what if you turn it upside down? Which is a wonderful question, and it's even in the curriculum that they're going to do next. And Jay asks the question. But Laura gets all upset because we're not talking about that yet. Doesn't honor that question, doesn't, And it gets worse. So now she's decided that Jay and 3 or 4 of the other children are problems. So she puts them in a table together. So there they are at a table together, and they're, she's got the kids at different tables, and so she puts them together. I think maybe she thinks, that I can handle those kids if they're all together. And the sad thing is, the kids in the class know already, oh, these are those kids. These are the kids that. So at one point, this breaks my heart. If you're a teacher, I'm sorry, don't ever do this. She lets them choose their groups. Nobody chooses anybody at that table. Nobody. So Jay and the other kids work together. Well, honestly, they would be better off working with some other people in the classroom. But they work together, and they don't stay on task, and they have some problems understanding what they're supposed to be doing. So then, Laura decides, well, that's not working. So she literally splits the 4 kids up and puts them in a chair at a table by themselves at the corners of the room. So she totally marginalizes them. I mean, literally marginalizes them, and of course marginalizes them. And at one point, Jay is sitting here, the woman drew a picture of the classroom, and Laura is almost always standing here with her back to him. And so, slowly, as the school year progresses, Jay gets more and more discouraged, and the researcher cannot stand it. She just can't stand it. So she decides, I'm taking him under my wing. I can't see this happen. I know this is not what you're supposed to do in research, but this is what I'm doing. She knows he has an interest in bugs, and so she takes him to the university, and they need an entomologist, and the entomologist teaches him how to collect specimens and how to make sure that you've drawn them correctly, that you notice their particular characteristics, that you can place them in the right genus or whatever it is, sorry. And he does great. He loves it. He is very organized. He's very observant. The entomologist at the school said, wow, he notices things. This kid is very observant. Jay writes a paper that Kathleen helps him with. She doesn't help him write the paper. She just asks him what he's thinking, and he writes down what he's thinking, and she shows him a model, says, this is what she's asking you to do. How does this model start? And he says, oh, it starts with a question. Maybe I can start mine with a question. So he writes this lovely paper about the eagle, and the teacher says, who wrote this? Yeah, so this is kind of a horror story. And at one point, poor little Jay says, do you think I talk proper? And Kathleen says, what do you mean? He says, I don't think I talk proper. And so this is the Gollum effect. By the end of the school year, Jay knows he's dumb. He acts up in class to get attention. He becomes what the teacher thought he was at the beginning of the year. It's really it's a sad book, but I think it's a very good book for understanding how these things can happen. And that's the sociocultural law. It says this is what happens. Sorry. So these dominant cultural practices are what determine what we think of as normal. So in the case of Laura, she has mostly white middle-class kids. And so Jay, who is African-American and comes from a different kind of family and culture, she immediately marks him as a problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit about unequal childhoods. I'm not going to spend too much time. I could go on. This is a really wonderful book, too. This book is about, it was another longitudinal ethnographic study of poor families, middle-class families, poor and working-class families, and middle and upper-middle-class families, comparing the parenting styles. But what I really like about this book is that it's not bashing poor parents. In fact, the author makes a real effort to say, look what these parents are doing that is really cool. And look what these middle-class and upper-middle-class parents are doing that isn't so cool. One of the things that the middle-class parents do is they look at their child and they say, oh, he really likes piano, so let's give him piano lessons. And he likes soccer, so let's put him in the soccer team. And he really likes art, so let's put him in art class. And these kids are scheduled to the hilt. Now, I think maybe there's been some reaction against this, but this is still true. These children have a schedule that would terrify me. And the parents, of course, are driving them everywhere. So these kids are 8 to 10. So this idea of concerted cultivation, my child has a talent, I have to help that child develop that talent. And that means I'm going to give them all these extra classes and all these extra, they're going to be in classes all night if they need to be. They have to do their homework. They have to get good grades. The other thing that goes along with this is that the parents are teaching the children how to interact with adults. So one example is her argument is that class totally trumps race. So she has an African American middle class family, and the mother is taking the son to the doctor, and she's rehearsing with him. What kind of questions are you going to ask the doctor? How is the, what are you going to ask him about those bumps under your arm? And how do you feel about this? And so when the child gets to the doctor, he asks the questions. He's learning how, this kid's 10, he's learning how to interact with adults, which works very well in school. This works very well in school. This is what we expect as teachers. The poor and working class parents have something called natural growth. In other words, the kid is going to be okay. My job is to make sure he gets plenty of food, to make sure he has shelter, to make sure he goes to school and does his homework. But it's not my job to notice his talents and bring those out. My job is just to keep him safe and secure and make sure he knows he's loved. Well, what that results in is kids who have a lot of free time. They play. They don't have a schedule. They go out and play. And the other cool thing about it is that they play with different age kids. When you think about when you have a child that's on a soccer team or in a ballet or whatever, lots of times they're with groups that are the same age. But these kids are doing a pickup basketball game where they may be playing with somebody 16 and they're 10. And they learn how to interact with other children. They make up their own rules. They make up their own games. They referee their own games. They learn how to solve problems. They learn how to compromise. They learn how to get over, I don't think that shot was bad, that kind of thing. So she is trying to make the point that there are skills that working class and poor kids have that are wonderful skills to have in life, but they don't translate to school. They don't translate. The story that I think is most telling is a child comes in and he has a trophy that he got in his soccer. I'm just going to say soccer. One of the kids played a lot of soccer. He won his soccer game and he has a trophy. And the teacher just makes of it, says, "Wow, that's terrific. You won a soccer game. That's terrific," or I don't know, tournament or something. And then another little kid says, "I won pickup basketball this week," or "Our team won pickup basketball." She goes, "Oh, that's nice." There's no trophy, there's no sign. In fact, it might be that he's a better basketball player than the kid is a soccer player, but he didn't get a trophy, so it gets ignored. And the other thing about it is that the parents in the working class and poor families think it's a teacher's job to take care of my child. I don't need to be overseeing the teacher. And it's funny, even though the teachers, she didn't talk to too many teachers, but even the teachers that thought the middle class parents were better parents were annoyed by their interventions. They were annoyed that a parent calls me all the time, that kind of thing. But they'd say, the working class parents, poor parents, they don't care about their kids' education. Because A, it's hard for them to get to the school. B, they really don't believe it's their job to take care of. It's the teacher and it's me. I'm the parent. And I take care of my child at home and the teacher takes care of the child at school. So this idea is that these non-white, in many cases, but also just poor children are less than or deficient because they don't have the right culture. So we have a teaching force that is majority white, majority middle class, and at an elementary level, majority female. That's the problem. We need a lot more people teaching who are not white and middle class. And I'm sorry to say, not always well prepared to see cultural difference as simply a difference and not call it a deficit. And this is something that I work really hard with. In our department, we work really hard on, but I have this joke, I say it's inoculating because when you get into a school culture, a lot of times you just fall into that culture, and the culture often is poor is deficient. And it's easy to blame the child and the child's culture rather than look at your own practice. And I know that's true for me too. I did it when I was a high school teacher. Yeah, it's not my fault, it's that kid's parent or that kid's family. It's just easy to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ruby Payne's book, A Framework for Understanding Poverty. It's a horrifying book. The really horrifying thing about it is it's a self-published book, and she has a company, and she actually has in-service materials that people use still. I know they used them in Grinnell at one point. And her argument is that There is a culture of poverty, and it has hidden rules. And we as teachers need to learn those hidden rules so we'll understand our children who are poor. And that seems nice, doesn't it? Seems kind. And well, here are some of the hidden rules. In a poor person's home, the noise level is always high. The television is on and everyone talks at once. That's a rule. In middle-class homes, people take turns. Another rule. Poor people see money as needing to be spent, and middle-class people see it as needing to be managed. I'm like, well, duh, if you don't have any money, you gotta spend it, right? I mean, this is, I don't know, anyway. Poor people, they see the present as most important. They focus on the present. Poor and middle-class people focus on the future. Do you see that this is not neutral, right? And she has absolutely no research to back this up. In fact, she even says it's my husband's experience as a poor person that I'm using to reach these conclusions. Yes. So she is really trying to convince us that poor children are deficient while pretending that they're just different. One of her strategies is to say, she talks about poor children have knowledge. They have a lot of knowledge. Let's take this test and see if you can pass this test as a middle-class person. I bet you don't have this knowledge. I bet you don't know which grocery store has the best trash cans to find food in. I bet you don't know how to get out of jail. Seriously, this is the kind of, and it just, I think it's horrifying, and it's even more horrifying that it's used in in-services across the country. But again, it's an attempt to say, this is a different culture, and this is a myth. There is no culture of poverty. It was debunked in the 60s when the sociologists first proposed it. It does not exist. There's not one thing that you assume about a poor person that is true of all poor people. Poor people don't use more drugs. Poor people care about their children's education. Poor people have orderly homes that are quiet. Poor people love their children. These are all true things. The assumptions or the myths about poverty, there's just no basis for them. There's nothing, it's not true. Okay. The other thing about this cultural effect on disability is that we have disproportionate representation of people of color in special ed classes. If you look at this, white students, 16 to 21, I'm sorry, that's 6 to 21. That should be 6 to 21. Sorry, that's a typo. 8.64% were labeled as disabled, about maybe 8.5% in the whole white population of that age group. Blacks, it's 20%. And Latinos, it's 17 and a third almost. Well, I always say to my students, unless you believe, first of all, you have to believe in race. So you have to believe there is something called a black race and a Latino race, which of course doesn't exist. So let's, we have to throw that on the water. But let's just say, you believe that black people are less intelligent and more likely to be in special ed. If you believe that, then that statistic doesn't bother you. But I don't believe that. So that statistic really bothers me. There's something going on here. Well, there is really something going on here because the federal government issued a memorandum, which is, you've got to do this or you're going to be sued. And actually, the university, what is it called? City High School in Iowa has been sued for this very reason. Recently, the states are required to track and report annually disproportionate representation of racial and ethnic groups in special education. They have to send those into the federal government. And this is tricky, they have to determine if that disproportionality is due to inappropriate identification. Well, I think I can just say that's a problem. And then finally, if they decide that it is because of disproportionate, or someone else decides, which is what happened with City High, they have to present a plan to address that disproportionality. And this is also written into the IDEA law. So the federal government recognizes that disproportionality is a problem. It exists and it is a problem. Why does it exist? I say it's because disability is socially constructed. That's why it works that way. Okay. I don't think I'm going to get through all this, but we can add it on next time. Because I'm speaking more slowly. All right. This is the so if you put, I'm not doing left and right politically, I'm just saying, if you put medical model over here, critical disability studies is way over here. It's very far apart. It's says, and I love this idea, disability is a verb. It is something that we do. It's not a thing, it's something we do. It's not something that is, it's something we do to people. It's parallel to the AAA statement. It's an invention. It's an invention that we use to separate people from normal and abnormal, deficient and wonderful, good, bad. And so it's not the disability, it's not the difference in the human being that is the problem. It's the meaning we assign to that difference, just like with race. So if we look at somebody and we say that person is using a wheelchair, and we decide that that person is disabled, and we treat them as disabled, they become disabled. But they are not disabled because of using a wheelchair. That's just a difference. It's no difference than wearing glasses, or having hearing aids, or needing maybe to take a medication in the morning. It's a difference. And it's not within a person. Yes, no one is denying that there are differences, that people have chromosomal differences or biological differences. This is not, critical disabilities isn't saying those things don't exist, but it's not the disability that's in the person. It's the difference. And we assign deficit status to it. We say, that's a deficit. This is, remember when I showed you the slide on deaf culture? The deafness isn't a disability, it's just a difference. You don't get to tell me that being deaf makes me disabled. I get to decide that I'm not disabled. Deafness is not a disability. I say it isn't. I'm the person. I get to say that. Therefore, critical disability studies rejects the whole medical model. This whole idea of diagnosis, finding the disability, treating the disability, that sort of language is, the critical disabilities theory completely rejects that idea. Difference is normal. We're all different. Guess what? There is no normal. Difference is normal. There is no one perfect person in the world. Well, maybe Brad Pitt. I don't know. But, there's no one perfect person, right? And it's positive to be different. It's necessary. It's a good thing to be different. And I have to say that my experience with, I've had students in my classes recently at the college, because the college has become more open to admitting people that are different. And I had a student in my class who was on the spectrum. She had some big differences. One time she got upset because she hadn't done the reading and she threw herself on the floor and screamed. And I didn't know what to do, so I just sort of went over and one of my students said, don't touch her, she doesn't like to be touched. So I said, okay. She got herself together, she went to the bathroom, she came back to class, everything was just fine. And I got to know her. She had a pet ferret she wanted me to come see. I never did go see her ferret, but she was a terrific writer, a wonderful thinker, and it was so important to have her in a class when we're talking about disability, because she was an embodiment of somebody who had this human difference, but she was wonderful to have in the class. She was so bright. She asked the best questions. She was just, I learned so much from her. And that different perspective that she brought to the classroom, that was crucial to the class. It made it probably the best version of that class I've ever taught. And this is what we speak about diversity all the time. Oh, we want people to be diverse. Diversity is so wonderful, but we only mean a certain kind of diversity, right? And also, assigning a label to somebody is a political act. This gets back to the critical. It is a political act. It's something that more powerful people do to less powerful people. That's what the deaf culture is reacting against. When we assign someone a label, we put that into motion, a set of policies that fixes that person as deficient, as there's something wrong with them. And it's also a moral act. And I think this is the part that bothers me most. We understand that a disability, that having a disability lessens that person in the eyes of the world. And yet we still do it. I think that's unethical. So that's my own opinion. Like I said, this is my theory. I'm not really, there are other people who believe this as well, but this is what I'm calling it, critical disability theory. So I think that the idea of the moral and the political aspects of disability studies are really important. And I'm not going to be able to get through a couple more slides, but I will start with those next week maybe, depending on what time we have. And I think I'm done. Is that what that means? Okay. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Jean. You're not entirely done because we'll see you again next week. And we thank you for your diligence in trying to talk more slowly.
Did I do that?
Yes, you did a good job.
It went worse. It was worse at the end. I know.
Did a great job. Thank you. We'll see you all back again next week. In the meantime, stay between the raindrops and keep yourself warm. See you next week. Thank you for coming.